Okay, hi, my name is Spires, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on the ethics of psychology, basically explaining what the ethics of psychology are, how a researcher should uphold them, and how we as community members and potential participants should uphold these values. So the first thing I wanted to do was kind of explain what is ethical psychology. According to the American Psychological Association, ethics express the professional values foundational to a profession. And in psychology, that includes clinical practice, education, research, and publication. And then, like I mentioned just a second ago, in psychology, the American Psychological Association is the thing that monitors the ethics of psychological experiments. So how are they monitored? Like, what is this, like, the American Psychological Association? Okay, like, what is that? So basically, it's a funded organization that first developed a code of conduct in 1953 to aid psychologists in conducting ethical research. The APA's goal is to protect participants and researchers from any kind of misconstruction that could be going on. And then since that, the institutional review boards have developed at universities and institutions that have the purpose of evaluating the ethical nature of research that's conducted. It's basically a way to kind of check your back and check behind you and make sure that the research that you're conducting is ethical according to APA guidelines. And then on the participant side of things, the Office for Human Research and Protections is responsible for ensuring the well-being of participants when they're in research, especially in psychological research. There's a lot that could happen with like your mental well-being and things like that. So the Office for Human Research Protections is the way that you would go and figure that kind of thing out. So what are these ethical guidelines? Like, what are they? Why were they put in place? That kind of thing. So on the right side, I have a list of the top 10 things that are mentioned in the APA's Code of Conduct. And on the left side, I have the research ethics that are very heavily talked about in our textbook and in our class, which include informed consent, confidentiality, debriefing, and deception. Whereas on the right side, there's a lot of things about advertising and public statements, record keeping and fees, education training, therapy, research and publication, that kind of thing. So on that left side, there's a lot more applicable to our class, and that is what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. So the first one I wanted to talk about is informed consent. Informed consent is a way that a researcher should let a participant know of all of the risks that are involved within an experiment. It's basically a way to make sure the participant knows what's going on and has given verbal consent and written consent to participate in this study. Some things to know about informed consent is that participants have the right to withdraw from the study at any point and for any reason. And then some of the things that should be said during this phase of informed consent is the purpose of the research must be stated. If there are any limits of confidentiality, those must be made known. Any kind of incentives for participation must be clear, and you must provide contacts or questions about this study. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was confidentiality. Confidentiality is basically a way to maintain privacy between a participant and the results of their experiment or whatnot. So there's a big difference between being confidential and being anonymous. When something is confidential, it is exposed to the proper people in the proper place at the proper time, but can still be tied to you as an individual and connected with your data. Whereas if something is anonymous, it cannot be tied to you in any way, shape, or form. The next thing to know about confidentiality is that participants have the right to confidentiality throughout all of a research experiment. Any kind of information that is not meant to be shared with certain people should not be shared. APA guidelines state that. And then confidentiality remains intact unless for legal reasons things must be reported. For example, if you find out there's any kind of abuse going on within within a participant's personal lives, confidentiality is allowed to be broken to report that to the proper authorities and just make sure that everybody is safe during all of these studies. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was debriefing. Debriefing is basically a way for psychologists to provide information about the nature, methods, results, conclusions, and purpose of research. It's a place where the researcher can correct any misconceptions that participants may have about the study that they just participated in, and is a way to kind of clear up all of those misconceptions and make sure that everybody has a sound understanding of what just happened. In the debriefing, the researcher must mention the nature, methods, results, conclusions, and true purpose of the research, and this will become a little bit more clear as we move on to deception. This is the last of these points that I wanted to bring up. Deception is something that is used when if a participant would not have their true reaction or to inform the participant would result in invalid results. Deception is used, but it should only be used when other methods are not possible. So only in a case where the participant knowing certain information would result in invalid results should deception be used. You must exhaust all other options before the use of deception. And if there's any kind of physical pain or just mental instability pain kind of thing that could be involved in an experiment, deception is not to be used. You are not to deceive the subject and then inflict any kind of physical pain on them. That is just not following APA code of conduct. And then, like I mentioned before, participants remain the right to withdraw throughout the entire experiment. This includes after finding out that they have been deceived during the debriefing process. So now that we understand some of those critical parts of the ethical guidelines in psychology, what is our part? What is the point in us doing this? Basically, as the public and potential participants in research, we're responsible for knowing our rights. And we also need to learn how to consume psychological information critically and wisely. There are 5 points that our book brings up that I kind of want to break down and discuss that can help us to consume psychological information critically and wisely. The first 2 of these 5 points are to avoid overgeneralizing based on little information, and then how to distinguish group results and individual needs. So basically, research experiments are conducted under very specific constraints. So without knowing the full story, avoid overgeneralizing information from a study without all of the information. One example that I want to provide on this on our next slide is that only minority students are able to make substantial gains in school. I just want to expand a little bit more on that on the next slide. And then on distinguishing between group results and individual needs, you need to avoid becoming too specific with interpretations of results. One thing to keep in mind is that group conclusions do not represent all conclusions. Every person is unique, and every person is not going to fit in every single standard or every single, most that psychological experiment may present to you. And then one example I want to discuss on the next slide is new parents and their baby's milestones. So like I mentioned, overgeneralization is something that can happen quite frequently and did happen here in the results of this experiment. So basically in 1987, there was a study conducted that showed that students who are less adequately educated can make more gains in school. However, since that has come out, the data has been misinterpreted by many to say only minority students are able to make substantial gains in school, when the actual data was surveyed over all undereducated students, not just minorities. There is an overgeneralization made saying that just because some students were minorities and made large gains and substantial gains in school, that all students that were minorities are able to make these gains in school. That is just simply not true, because not all minority students are undereducated. And then when you're taking a generalization and applying it to an individual, Parents often struggle with taking generalizations and applying them to their specific child, especially new parents and early development with their children. Like on the example that I have on the bottom, especially in those first couple months, first year and a half-ish of a child's life. But statistics for most does not mean specific statistics for all, and deviances are okay. And then one fun little fact I wanted to throw in there was even Einstein didn't speak until he was 3 years old. It's okay to not be in the most category of a lot of these things, and you just need to be wary of kind of bringing a large conclusion into a specific need of one individual. And then the next 3 points that our book brings up that I wanted to discuss was to look for answers beyond a single study, avoid contributing cause where none have been found, and make sure to consider your source. So as far as looking for answers beyond a single study, oftentimes research studies are developed as a result of other research studies. And so these continuous studies can kind of show errors or evidence of bias in previous experiments, basically saying that if you just look at one, there is potential for error, there's potential for bias, there's potential for a lot of things to happen. So making sure you go on to continue to read and look for more than one study to either support a point or just find out information. And the example I wanted to provide with that is wasteful discovery task. And then avoid contributing cause where none have been found. This is something that I think is very concrete and in the basics of psychology, is that correlation is not the same thing as causation. And just because something had an effect on an outcome does not mean that it's the sole cause of that outcome. And an example that I wanted to provide with that is the Hawthorne effect. And the last thing I wanted to kind of explain on was to make sure that we consider the source, especially of psychological information, because when it comes to psychological data, it's important to consider that source because there's a lot of falsified information out on the internet. Are you looking at a peer-reviewed journal, or is there a website that could contain bias? And then one extra little point I wanted to put in there was that anything on the APA website is reviewed and checked for accuracy, and it's a great place to look for a lot of your sources and data and things like that. That's where I got most of the information for this presentation, if I'm being completely honest. So these 3 examples that I kind of wanted to explain on and provide a little bit more information is that confirmation bias can oftentimes be a reason why one person can typically only look at one study. In the 1960s, the Wade-School discovery tasks were conducted, and he demonstrated that people have a tendency to look for information that confirms their existing beliefs. This type of bias can influence the decisions we make and lead to poor or faulty choices. So we need to, as a society, just make sure that we're searching a little bit more than just that one study or that one thing that proves the thing that we're looking for. The next thing that I wanted to kind of explain a little bit more on is the Hawthorne effect. It's a great example to explain that correlation is not the same thing as causation. The study was conducted in a factory in Illinois where worker conditions were improved, and researchers saw an increase in productivity, so they assumed increased change in conditions was what resulted in the change of production, when in reality, it was the researcher's presence that caused the change in production. So just kind of learning that, these change in factory conditions definitely probably had something to do with the productivity of the factory, but it was not the sole reason that the productivity of the factory grew. And then the last point that I wanted to bring up was that the APA website is always a good place to look and check the validity of arguments posted online. And if you don't have access to that, seeking information and checking the credentials of an author is very important. We need to avoid being first page clickers, like it said in that TED Talk video about fake news. And we need to make sure that we're searching for verified resources, especially when it comes to psychological experiments and research. And then this last page is just a thing to show a lot of my references and where I got all of my information for this presentation. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day.